Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island of the City University of New York. Today we continue the City University's celebration of Black History Month with a Black independent narrative film, Killer of Sheep by Charles Burnett and directed in 1978. This film stands in a remarkable contrast, I think, to what we programmed last week, which was King Vidor's Hallelujah, an early Hollywood portrayal of Black life. This, of course, is a portrayal directed by a Black director, written and about the conditions of Black life in the United States in the late 70s. We'll be talking about all of those issues and some other things after today's screening with Professor Basil Wilson of John Jay College of the City University of New York. Enjoy Charles Burnett's intriguing Killer of Sheep. Hi, welcome back. I think you've just seen a rather extraordinary and intriguing film. There's a lot to talk about today about Charles Burnett's Killer of Sheep. But before we get on to those specific topics, let me introduce today's guest. We have the pleasure today of having Professor Basil Wilson of the John Jay College of the City University of New York. Basil's the chair there of the African American Studies program, and he's the author, more accurately co-author with another CUNY faculty member, of a recent book, which has in fact received quite a nice press in terms of review in the United States, but New York as well, Basil, and that's The Struggle for Black Empowerment in New York City Beyond the Politics of Pigmentation. Well, Basil, I thought we might start with an issue which I guess you could call an issue of empowerment, and that's this film portrays in a number of ways the differences of possible empowerment of blacks lower down on the economic scale. Mm-hmm. What exactly is being portrayed here, do you think?
Well, I think the film gives us some sense as to the relationship that exists between the working class and a black underclass. One of the things that the film brings out quite vividly is that most of the people depicted in the film are divorced from the means of production. They're not engaged in any productive activity. And here we have the leading figure struggling, in a sense, to keep his family together, trying to get back into the employment market, but finding it difficult to survive. Yet still that he's been bombarded by offers coming from people in the underclass to really engage in certain kinds of illegal activities. So you get that juxtaposition then between a working class person who is temporarily unemployed and the permanently unemployed who have developed a certain dynamic, a certain relationship to the existing society.
Well, I think that's, to me, that's one of the issues that's frequently excluded from forms of discourse about the things. That is, you're talking about a distinction which, I mean, yes, I think we can read about the distinction in the New York Times, but it's not, in a lot of popular discourse, it's not as emphasized as I think perhaps some of us would want it to be.
Yes, definitely. You know, I've just got a package from a good friend of mine who is a specialist and is doing research on the black underclass. And when you look at that literature, often it looks at the underclass as if they're a permanent class. The literature has failed to really connect the fluidity that exists between the working class poor and the underclass. And I think one of the things that the film does bring out is that temptation, how that ethos, how that environment, in essence, portrays or encourages a kind of behavior that often, contradicts or conflicts with the existing social order, with the existing social laws.
The other thing that strikes me is that's quite singular about this film is that we don't have a lot of films which portray, even if this is a slaughterhouse, and we'll talk about that as a metaphor in a little while, but portray genuinely the conditions of industrial production.
No, there's a tendency for films really to romanticize people's existence, not only independent films, but commercialized films. That they tend to give us a sense as if life does, it does not deal with the day-to-day struggles of people. And I think what Burnett has done is to show this in a rather startling way, the difficulty that this individual is having then in keeping his family together, in trying to return to the work of to the world of work.
One of the things that has always struck me about this is that this takes place in a part of the country, Southern California, which is normally conceived of now as one of the leaders of the transformation of America from an industrial into a service economy. I mean, this is one of the places where presumably it's all clean. We all now work for financial services companies or little catering companies or something like this. And so we have this notion that there's in this environment a whole world that still exists, that there still is an industrial.
Yeah, California is part of what is now called the Sun Belt.
Right.
It is the Sun Belt that had wrested economic expansion from the Frost Belt, which is where we reside in the northeastern part of this country. The Sun Belt is where high tech was supposed to be concentrated. It was where the energy industry was in fact concentrated. It was where the economy was expanding at a rapid pace. But yet still in this film, we see these people in terms of their lives living in a very desolated kind of existence, where they're unemployed, they're in a sense almost, their energy has been sapped. I mean, that's one of the things that I found quite striking about the film, that the energy level of people in the film has in fact been deprived. There is really no response, there's really no concerted effort to respond to the kind of social milieu in which they find themselves. They're not fighting against the attempts to dehumanize them.
It's always struck me that in certain of the more romantic portrayals of black family life in the United States, which, by the way, I think run exactly parallel to the overly romanticized portrayals of other family lives. I mean, the degree of romanticization may not be that different. Is that what they're always sort of about is showing you what the essence of these people are. And the essence is never something that is influenced by material conditions. That the notion of a family life being driven by an economy, being driven by a particular place in the political structure of a city is frequently just erased.
Well, that's not just a problem of films. That's also a problem of scholarship.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of scholars who are writing about problems dealing with the whether it is drugs, whether it is dealing with the family, who in fact deal with this in a very isolated manner from the economic condition. And one of the things that we do know is that economics often determines whether people are able to remain cohesive, whether they're able to send their kids to school. In fact, in one clip in the film, there is a conversation between two children, two girls, and one is saying, "Why aren't you going to school? If you do not go to school, you're going to be falling behind." And she's not going to school, obviously based upon the sort of economically deprived conditions that her family finds itself in.
Right, and we can, alas, predict the entire cycle, or at least some of the forks in the road that will come as a consequence of that. So, for you, I take it as, and it would be for me, that one of the virtues of this film while it is extremely stark in a number of ways, it makes those connections.
It makes those connections, and I think there's also the connection between generations. I mean, much of the film spends some time on children in their innocence at play. So even though these children are surrounded by this degradation, even though they're surrounded by an economic crisis, which it is, that they in fact are fulfilling their lives in their innocence, even though in some respects they're forced to connect with this economic deprivation. There's a clip in which the fellow is saying, I need money, he needs $1. And obviously there's no dollar that will be forthcoming. But obviously, even though he's deprived of this dollar, he and his friends find a way to enrich their lives. But yet still, you know, what I think Burnett does quite effectively is that in their play, they're surrounded by danger. There are always motor cars, there are always the possibility of death looming, you know, around them.
Well, there's an interesting thing about this film that I think connects with that to me, and that it is that while it portrays real political and economic conditions, there's a way in which it's not a realist film. And by that I mean, I don't mean it's not confined to simply recording these facts. Now, it does record those facts, but it suggests that in the nature of this situation, people have desires. The children have the capacity to protect themselves through a kind of a fantasy. So it's not that here are these facts and here are these people. The people respond to these facts in different kinds of ways, or incapable of responding.
No, yeah, I mean, there is definitely response. I mean, there is in fact response coming from the people who are portrayed as members of the underclass. In some respects, what they're engaged in is they're responding to the system. They're fighting back in the way that they know how. It might be through stealing a television. It might be through engaging in illegal activities. One of the things that I find missing from the film is that it does not show anybody in the film who is engaged in a political response to the economic deprivation. There is really no discussion as to how is it that they got themselves in this condition and who is responsible for this kind of structural unemployment which has persisted in the black community since World War II.
Right, right. Well, that might that be a limitation of in one sense, that might follow from an artistic choice that Burnett has made, and that's to focalize this through this family, and that's part of the portrayal is that they do not conceive of political solutions here.
Yes, in some respects it's a non-political film. Well, I wouldn't say it's a non-political film, but they themselves are perceived as being apolitical.
Right, yes.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between being apolitical and being non-political. But I do think that there is a certain strength, an inner strength, that this young man manifests. He's constantly being offered ways in which he can extricate himself from his predicament, yet still he's really seeking some kind of wholesome solution. So there's a certain inner strength that he manifests in the film. Although what I think is also quite interesting is that it also shows that this, having been in the state of unemployment, affects the love relationship that exists between his woman and himself.
Right.
And of course, that I think, you know, has to be understood, because that is, in fact, Burnett trying to give us some insight as to how often families begin to fall apart.
Right. Well, it's also sort of interesting to me that the generational thing is brought up between the parents and the children, but the film in some way suggests the breakup of what was taken to be one of the former strengths before the movement to industrial cities, and that is of the extended family that was available through multiple generations and also through other connections in agrarian societies, which is frequently cited for the survival under terrible conditions as I've understood it, of black families when the black experience was primarily that of being an agrarian worker or sharecropper.
You know, there's an epic work produced by a historian who taught at City College, who died a few years ago, Herbert Gutman. And in his study of the black family, which begins in slavery and takes it right up to 1925, what Gutman reveals is that the family, the extended family, was quite instrumental in the African Americans surviving the viciousness of slavery. And of course, slavery being rooted in a rural environment on the plantation, it meant that one could use not only the extended family, but one could create a distinctive cultural system. What one sees in Burnett's film is the erosion of this extended family. And obviously that has ramifications for how people then begin to fight back, how people withstand the sort of pressures that they're exposed to in this kind of extreme urbanized environment.
Well, this is, I just have to stop for a second and chat a little bit about the contrast between this film and the one that I hope some people watching tonight had seen last week, which is Hallelujah by King Vidor, because one of the virtues of, as we discussed, of Hallelujah is the fact that it is an attempt at portraying what the extended family life was for black families in the rural agrarian South in a post-Civil War era, after slavery, and the extension of family life into sharecroppers or small landholders. Interestingly enough, even in that film, when the protagonist is tempted away, that means he has far more contact with the towns, which even there are, in modest terms, the industrial centers. It's the mill town, okay? So it's a form of industrial production, not of agrarian production. And that's where we see the chief threat to the family life being. But here, I mean, perhaps we also remarked about one of the lies in Hallelujah is that the economic conditions of those families could be productive enough that everybody would want to stay there for a very long time, as opposed to the economic incentives that have drawn countless blacks away from that agrarian culture to the industrial centers.
Yeah, and I think in Burnett's film, you know, we don't see any linkage between the urban and the rural.
Yeah.
It's almost as if that link to the South has been disconnected. And quite interestingly, the West always attracted large numbers of blacks. They were going there, in a sense, to fulfill the promise of the American dream. And here we see in this sort of desolate environment that the promise is not really being fulfilled in any sense at all.
It's interesting. I was just chatting with a friend who's a scholar who's based in Southern California, and the demographics of Southern California have now changed. I mean, they have been changing constantly. I mean, it's a place of constant change. But there's a way in which blacks in an industrial center there are now more of a minority than they are in other places because of the extremely high percentage of Asian and Hispanic immigrants as well, so that there's a sense of marginalization. He's a scholar who lived in Washington, D.C. for many years and moved to Southern California, and he had this great sense of the absence of black culture.
And we have the same phenomenon in Florida, where the indigenous African American population in Florida has really felt marginalized by the influx of immigrants coming from Latin America, and where they feel as if not only are they in a state of powerlessness, but they have become expendable.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. Another thing that I've thought about this film is how it contrasts with a number of the mainstream portrayals of black life. The two that come most to mind is that this is a film that comes out of the 70s, and which is a period in which Hollywood produced a number of films, some serious ones like Sounder, with a touch of romanticization in it, to be sure, but also others of the so-called black exploitation cycle. So I was wondering about the contrast between this and that cycle, and then also, obviously, the mass media has found black family life to be something wonderful to portray in television in recent years. So, what are some of your thoughts, Basil, about how this differs from some of those other portrayals in the 70s?
Well, being an independent filmmaker, right, Burnett obviously has control over his product. He's an independent artist. The black exploitation films were in fact became, they not only romanticized black life, but they really was a perfect example of escapism. It never really dealt with what was going on within the black community. And of course, in many respects, the movie industry sees itself as about the business of entertainment.
Right.
And I think Burnett sees himself as a filmmaker who is about the business of really portraying life as it is, in the nitty-gritty. And of course, you've always had this dialectic that has existed in this country and other countries between whether art should portray the nitty-gritty aspects of human life or whether it should in fact be, romanticize human life. I think in many respects we need both.
Right. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think there is a place for escapism. I think we all sometimes are affected by the drudgery of industrial life, of urban life, and there's room and there's a place for escapism.
Right.
Precisely.
Stories serve many.
But I think what we do find often is that we get a quintessential escapism that dominates entertainment to the extent that it prevents or it thwarts people looking into the lives that they're living. It prevents people from understanding the world in which they live. And I think films have a critical role in forcing the populace, or at least encouraging the populace in trying to understand the world in which they live.
Well, this comes back to something we talked about a little bit earlier, and that is the portrayal in Burnett's film of the tension, the fluidity, the relations between a working class and an underclass. What strikes me is in so many of the black exploitation films, one of their models is an earlier Hollywood model, and that's the gangster film.
Yes, yes.
And the gangster film, as many people have pointed out, is a form of American tragedy, but the terms of tragedy are the particular terms of capitalism. That the gangster is the person who either perfectly misinterprets capitalism or, as some of my friends would prefer, perfectly interprets it.
I would go with the latter. I think the gangster perfectly interprets capitalism, and often, in fact, even in Burnett's film, there's really no sense that one is living in a particular kind of society. There's no mention of capitalism. It's almost as if the leading figures involved are immersed in a system in which they themselves are bewildered, they're perplexed by it. And in that respect, they haven't got the consciousness or the wherewithal to fight back in a politicized sense.
Well, it's a strange paradox to me, because the black exploitation films would never mention the word capitalism themselves, but the terms of success are almost an ABC of what the society wants. You make these kinds of deals, you are empowered in certain kinds of ways, and the terms of empowerment are usually money and luxury.
Well, the underclass, underclass culture is very much linked to what is defined in the society as successful. Underclass culture is not something that is removed from the values of the larger society. It is in fact rooted in the values of the larger society, which is greed, violence, affluence, wealth. It's about the business of the accumulation of wealth. And it is just that it takes the position that one should go about the accumulation of wealth at anyone's expense. And of course, that points to the sort of crisis in which we find ourselves in urban society and in suburban society, where there's really no value system. We have a sort of amoral kind of culture in which anything goes, and one is in fact embraced if one is successful, irrespective of how one achieves that success.
Well, that's one of the reasons that's interesting is because in the black exploitation films, to me, the protagonist there, even if they begin as underclass, it's always a good guy who's underclass who's going to beat out a set of clearly defined antagonists who are usually worse, but are defined exactly in the terms that you're saying. They have the money, and the point is that they may have gotten it in a bad way, but even if you beat them and you get it, then you're well off and you can now be respected in some way. Now, what's interesting to me is the way in which Burnett's film contrasts with that, because the path of a kind of working class endeavor is erased from the black exploitation films. That is, people who do that are, if they're portrayed at all, are fools.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, with the major figure in Burnett's film, what the fellow is trying to do is he's caught between trying to be middle class as well as trying to prevent being underclass. In a sense that nothing is portrayed as the good or the bad guys in a sense. It's almost as if they're all in the business of survival. That clear dichotomy is not really vividly portrayed.
Well, or I think I'm just perhaps saying something you just said very well, but in slightly different terms. In the black exploitation films, there are always highly personalized antagonists. That even while the film may portray capitalism, it's always you beat out this person or these things, or you pull off this heist and you achieve this thing. Whereas here, it's not the antagonist. There isn't an antagonist per se. There's a set of conditions. You see what I mean? It's not personalized into the antagonist you must beat. There's a set of conditions
and
that must be dealt with.
Everyone finds themselves in this kind of condition. And of course, there's a certain perplexity about the film. That's how people respond to the condition. In the black exploitation films, people have a clear understanding as to how to respond. And I mean, they're moving about that with a clear objective. In the film, in the Burnett film, that is not the case.
Right.
It's almost as if they have been mesmerized by a system in which they do not clearly understand how to transcend their misery.
Right, because there's this goal orientation in the other films, but the path to those goals is always very clear. Here, it's a complicated matter and a mystifying matter to the character.
Yes, and I think the Burnett film is also much closer to reality. I mean, the black exploitation films gives us a sense as if, because of this energy, because of this romanticization of this kind of life, that the individual can easily transcend it. That transcendation or that transcendence is not easily attained in this film. That there are very serious systemic problems confronting these people. Not that they're incapable of, in fact, dealing with the system, but that these problems are real. And I mean, it is not something that one can solve just through, there's no quick panacea then.
Right.
It entails a protracted kind of struggle.
And a collective.
Yeah. And a collective response, which in fact we do not see coming into existence in the film.
Now, we've been talking about those sort of much more 70s products, black exploitation films, but how do you contrast this with some of the contemporary portrayals of black family life? I mean, we have a mega hit show called The Cosby Show, but there are other key portrayals of black family life on television as well.
Well, I think one of the things that we're beginning to understand now is the fact that black family life is not monolithic, that it is in fact variegated, that the family life that Burnett portrays in his film represent an aspect, a component of black life. The family life depicted in the Cosbys is somewhat romanticized, but that is also a component of black family life. So you get this variegation, which is something that if you look at situation comedies, if you look at the portrayals of white family life, you've always had that kind of variegation. I think we're just getting to the point now in this film industry as well as on television where this variegation is being captured, which I think is much more in tune with the reality.
Well, you know, one of the things I think that this film represents, we're using it just as an example of, is this community of young, well, I mean, there's been a tradition for a long while, but of emerging independent black filmmakers. We have, of course, Charles Burnett. Most people know Spike Lee, the one who has, and Robert Townsend, who've had breakthrough films. She's Gotta Have It, Do the Right Thing for Spike Lee, Robert Townsend's Hollywood Shuffle. But there are other filmmakers like Haile Garima, for example, is now involved in one of his feature film projects, which will be, I know, on the subject of slavery, and it is maintaining its independence by being self-financed in an unusual way that I know that Garima has promised his investors a copy of one of his other films on video cassette if they come in. And Burnett now is involved in a project that will bring him closer to the mainstream itself. I know that Danny Glover is involved in that. So we're getting this variety of voices that are being positioned in a variety of ways.
But I think what that also portrays is that creativity often comes from below. That here we have Hollywood with all the resources that they possess, that they have in fact gone stale. And much of the hits are coming now from independent producers. We see that definitely in terms of black films, that it is not really coming from the established studios, but from black independent filmmakers. So I hope that in terms of Spike Lee, that is not something that, you know, he will remain an isolated figure, but we will see breakthroughs from independent black filmmakers like Burnett and others like him.
Okay, well, I think we happen to have run out of time, but this is just the perfect way to end up, because I think all of us feel that what we want to see is more voices and more voices coming from different kinds
that depicts the richness and the diversity of human life.
Absolutely. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed our discussion here. I certainly hope that leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us.